So the focus of Unit 3, so we've done Unit 1, we've done Unit 2. There's so much in Unit 2 that is about the political institutions. In Unit 1, we talked a lot about democratization, what are our types of regimes, and those terms will continue to come back and back. And the advice that I give my students that is really the most important thing is understanding those concepts. If you have a really strong base in the concepts, then that's really your first key. And then it's thinking about examples of those concepts in the CG6 countries. So today we're going to talk about political culture and participation, focusing on civil society, which is a term that often a lot of comparative students struggle with. And we're going to look at political culture and ideology, which is also really your values and beliefs. And then what does political participation look like in both democratic regimes and authoritarian regimes? And then what do civil liberties and civil rights look like in those countries as well? And then we're going to finish off with our discussion on cleavages. So civil society, what I want you to remember about civil society, first of all, is that it needs to be voluntary. Second of all, it needs to be outside of the government. Okay, so those are the two key things with civil society. And civil society can come in lots of different forms, but those are the key things. They need to be voluntary and needs to be not controlled by the government. So the stronger liberal democracy that you have, then we're going to see civil society there. So you think about the United States, which I know is not a CG6 country, but most of you are very familiar with the United States government. A lot of you pair this course with U.S. government, so it makes a nice comparison as well. United States is a very strong liberal democracy. We have a very active civil society, okay? So when we think about our CG6 countries, the UK and Mexico are getting there, okay? UK even doesn't have a huge, long history of a civil society. This is something they used to be what we consider a corporatist state, and now they are considered a pluralist state. And the same thing with Mexico, used to be considered a corporatist state, is now a pluralist state, meaning that they have active civil society. So a word that I often use with my students to help them think about civil society is think about interest groups. So for example, I am a teacher and I am a member of the Virginia Education Association, also the NEA, the National Education Association. That is an interest group, okay? And I choose to participate in it. It is not controlled by the government. Do we actively engage and try to invoke policy to have the government write policy that benefits what we're interested in? Of course, that's a very big part of what interest groups do in the United States. But it is a group of people who have, this common interest. It's outside of the government. It's voluntary. Like I chose to join. Nobody made me join. So that's kind of that key word, though, that they're not technically political, but they are a big part of how we can articulate what is important to us. And so, for example, the NEA becomes a platform for me to share what is important to me, for the Education Association to share what is important, especially like in Virginia, where we have a platform, we can go and talk to the governor and so on. And that works with any interest group. So another part of civil society, especially when we're thinking about internationally and globally, because remember that's a big part of comparative politics, is that we're not just thinking about the US, we're thinking about these CG6 countries, the UK, Mexico, Russia, China, Nigeria, Iran. And when we're thinking about those, another part of civil society is also NGOs. Remember that a NGO is a non-governmental organization. And I like to use Amnesty International as my kind of go-to NGO. And so different countries, like a lot of authoritarian regimes, they actually limit the amount of NGOs in their country. Like China, they make you register. Same thing in Iran, NGOs have to register with the government. And so they may decide to not let certain NGOs in, especially because groups like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, they are looking to see what are human rights violations, like what's happening. There's groups that look at voting. So whatever topic there is some type of NGO that's interested in that. There are a lot of NGOs that come out of the United Nations, okay? So they are part of our civil society, our global civil society, if you will. So when we think about civil society, this is our, these are all examples of civil society. So church can even be like your religious group. That could be part of your civil society. So in the case of, say, Iran, it becomes mosques. Although, let's keep in mind, in Iran, remember that the mosques are really controlled by the government. Remember that the supreme leader, the Ayatollah, that he controls what the imams say on Fridays when they are meeting in the mosque. So this is something that maybe, say, in the UK, where churches and mosques and temples, they would be seen as civil society, active civil society, because they are free from government control. So in Iran, because it is a theocratic republic, they're not necessarily going to be free from government control. Even when you look at, say, Russia, the Eastern Orthodox Church, while it is separate from the government, the Eastern Orthodox Church very much does support President Putin. And so there is that kind of overlap. There is a reason that the Pussy Riot Girls chose to protest in a Orthodox church, because of the message that they were trying to get across. So again, it needs to be outside of the government. It's usually outside of your family, although as a family, you may be interested in a common interest. It could be a club, so anything, a charity, social clubs, youth groups. So when we think about, say, Russia, they have Nashi, and there's another group that they have that's very supported by Putin. So when you think about those, like the youth groups, the Nashi, the Russian youth group, again, is that if it's sponsored by the government, it's not civil society. And so that's the question you got to ask. Is it sponsored by the government? Is it a voluntary organization? And if it's not voluntary, and if it's sponsored by the government, then it's not civil society. Okay, so think about some civil society, keep an NGO in mind. But when it really comes down to is that we're going to see civil societies in liberal democracies. And remember, our two types of regimes that we're continually focusing on are democracies and authoritarian regimes. The UK, Mexico, and Nigeria will clearly say that they are democracies. China is clearly authoritarian. Iran is authoritarian. And Russia, we've argued for a while, is a hybrid. Some political scientists are ready to say it's authoritarian. Some are still like, we're kind of a little bit of an illiberal democracy, so we call them semi or soft authoritarian. But in essence, everything is falling into that two groups. And when we're talking about civil society, there's very little to no civil society in Iran, in China, and Russia. And so there's your difference there. You're going to see more in the UK, more in Mexico, and some in Nigeria. So political culture, let's think about that. So there's, when we're thinking about political culture, there's a couple of terms that I think often confuse students. We have political culture, political socialization, political ideology. So political culture is the big idea. Think about, this is more like what your country believes. Think about like what are some concepts or things that most Americans, most Nigerians, most British would believe in. It's something that as a group of people, that this is our political culture, okay? If we think that the rights of the individual are something that should be valued, if we think that free market economy and capitalism should be valued, those are part of your political culture. For example, after World War II, the UK, they said that we really value the welfare state, that is something that they established a welfare state, and they believed that was something that needed to happen. And that is something that they have protected. Now, while the Labor and Conservative parties may disagree on how much welfare state should exist, what should be funded, what should be not, neither one of them is going to say we need to get rid of it, okay? The Conservatives may want to cut back on some of the spending, but they definitely don't want to get rid of it. When we think about the concept of one of my favorite British concepts is, and I'm going to butcher this Latin word, it's a noblesse oblige. Because as Americans, we don't like that word, socialism and welfare state. But the British have this concept that it is the obligation, okay, of the wealthy, of those who are better well off, to take care of everyone. That obligation, that's what that noblesse oblige is. Another fantastic concept, I've got equality of opportunity versus equality of result. So when we think about in the United States, we really strongly believe in equality of opportunity. We try to provide everybody with the same opportunities, and then what you do with that, think about, we believe strongly that, you need to build yourself up, that you pulled yourself up from nothing, and you made this great empire or whatever. And we think about different people who did that. Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and even Donald Trump, to come from, maybe if you don't come from anything, and to build those things up. So equality of result is that no matter what is your opportunity or start to begin with, we're going to end up with the same result. So this is something that Russian culture very much values, okay? And so we're thinking about political culture. When you think about political culture, what has happened to you in your history can very much affect you. So for example, in the United States, due to the American Revolution, we take our individual freedoms very, very, very seriously, okay? That was something that, and also just that concept of individualism. I lived overseas for 6 years, and in that experience, I really was like, wow, I didn't realize how much Americans really valued individualism. And that's not something that you necessarily see, especially in Asian cultures. The group, the whole, is more important than the individual, okay? That's another kind of political culture concept. So think about things that people as a group would believe. So Nigeria, they're greatly influenced by their British colonial history, okay? That definitely has shaped their country. When you think about the start of Nigeria, they actually chose a parliamentary form of government. Now, such a diverse country with so many different ethnic groups, they found out quickly that didn't work, okay? And they needed to switch to a federal system, and they ended up switching to a presidential system. But they are still very much influenced by their British heritage. What is the official language of Nigeria? English, okay? When you think about Iran, think about the 1979 revolution, which totally revolutionized and changed Iran, everything they were doing. So we have the Shah before. The Shah, who is this very Western thinking in a lot of ways, although he was very much also authoritarian ruler. And he, when he was ousted, and in 1979, when they had the revolution that established that whole famous, this is the voice of Iran, and it's the Islamic theocratic republic that is established. And so religion is such an important part of Iranian political culture. If you think about, I always think this is rather interesting, just kind of shows the power of the Ayatollah, who, remember, the Ayatollah is he's the head cleric, okay? So Shia, there are two types of majority Muslims, are either Sunni or Shia. And about 80% are Sunni, and Shia is about 20%. And the Shia, predominantly, that's what they are in Iran. So when we're thinking about Iran, how important that religious leader is. They believe, that the Ayatollah Khomeini is the current one, that he is waiting until the hidden imam returns. Now, I want to get into a whole big Islamic religious discussion, but the point is that he is super important. Think about how important the Pope is to Catholics, okay? This is a very big important role. So in 2009, when people were protesting in the streets, people are dying. There's stuff on social media, and they're out and they're protesting President Ahmadinejad's re-election. And it's pretty clear that it seems to be, at least from the information that we have, that it was not a fair election. Either ballots were stuffed, something happened. This guy was less popular than he was when he was first elected, and he got re-elected with more votes than he did the first time. So there's a lot of fishy things going on. And the protests were continuing, even with the different people putting them down. They did not stop until the Ayatollah came forward and spoke. And when he said, you need to accept it, you need to move on, you need to stop, that's when it stopped. And so I think that's the important concept, just kind of remember how important religion is and what a central part that is to the political culture of Iran. Okay, so political socialization, remember that's the process by which we develop our political ideology. And schools are a great way to do that. Media, your family, they're also part of your political socialization. Now, in an authoritarian regime, they're going to use political socialization also to reinforce not only your political ideology, like what you believe about the government and what they should do, but they're going to use that to reinforce the country's political culture. So we have compulsory education in China. That is an important fact that we want to make sure every child is educated, and we want to make sure they're educated the right way. Think back to Mao and the Cultural Revolution. When Mao Zedong established Communist China, after a couple of years, he feels like the revolution is waning. And so he decides to arm young people. That's always a fantastic idea. So with their little red book in their hands, one of the first things that they did is they're getting rid of the old ways, the old thoughts. And they got rid of a lot of educated people. They got rid of their teachers and college professors, people who were challenging the system. And so authoritarian regimes will use their control of the media. They will use education, all of these things in order to try to make sure that you are getting the proper political socialization. So political ideology, these are all some really important terms. And we think about all these important terms here. So these are all different kind of types of political ideologies that the College Board has really said, these are ones you should know. Now, many of you know that on this 2020 AP test that we're not going to focus on units 3 and 4. So you may think, oh, I'm getting out of the whole economics part, but you do need to still understand some of those words like neoliberalism. So let's just kind of go through these, and these are literally just cut and pasted from the College Board website with basically like our little teacher's training manual for these important terms. So individualism, this is super strong in America. This is part of our political culture. The individual civil liberties and freedoms over governmental restrictions. Do people in the UK feel this way? Yes, they also would support this. People in Mexico as well. Okay, we're going to see this as something that we're going to really see kind of in democracies. Neoliberalism. So what I just like to say, if you're having any trouble with neoliberalism, just think free market economy, capitalism. That's what neoliberalism is. So when we're thinking about, so remember, we need to know our concept, but we also need to think about an example. So when have we seen neoliberalism policies? Who said this is part of my ideology? So Margaret Thatcher is a perfect example of that. When Margaret Thatcher and the conservatives took over control of the Parliament, specifically the House of Commons, one of the things that she brought in was neoliberalism policy. So one of the things that happens with neoliberalism is we move to privatization, which in essence means that businesses are not going to be owned by the government, but they're going to be owned by individuals. When you're thinking about economics, who controls the factors of production? Land, labor, resource, capital. Who controls that? Is it the people or the government? And it's the people in a capitalist society. So that's what privatization is. Also, after Mao Zedong died, then we had Deng Xiaoping, and Deng Xiaoping, he brought in also some neoliberalism. He brought in a little bit of capitalism. That quote I've said before, one of my favorites from Deng Xiaoping is that doesn't matter if the cat is black or white as long as he catches the mouse. So you think about Hong Kong and Taiwan, how that they have been allowed to have a lot of capitalism there, and then there's been little bits in throughout China as well. That has helped to build up their economy. So communism, there is no private property, there is no privatization. Everything is owned by the government, and the government controls the economy. So when we think about Russia, they had the Soviet Union when they were a communist state. And an interesting thing about communism, the only time that we see Russia's economy grow under communism was like under the new economic policy that Lenin did. And then, for example, when Stalin allowed the citizens to start growing over the quotas, and anything they grew over the quotas they could keep and sell themselves. He's having a problem with getting people to meet the quotas, and then he gave them an incentive. That's part of the problem with communism. There's not a whole lot of incentive to continue and produce more. And we're naturally selfish people, so that's kind of where the issue is. I digress, though. The whole point I was trying to get to here is that one of the things that we've seen actually is of interesting things, for example, in Russia, is that once they switched from being a communist state under the Soviet Union, and they've gone back to being Russia and the Russian Federation after we had Yeltsin and his shock therapy, President Putin, who has been ruling in some form of power since the late 90s, he has actually led to a lot, decrease the privatization of the oil and natural gas companies, has actually given more government control over those. And the oligarchs, some of them not too happy about that. The oligarchs, of course, are those who rose in power, wealthy businessmen who rose in power after the end and fall of communism. So socialism is that kind of happy medium, I like to say, between capitalism and communism. And so most of the countries in the world today function as socialist states where they have some government-controlled agencies because that's what's going to benefit and provide needs for the people. And then they also have some that are privatized. And the way that the British economy works is like a perfect example of this. Fascism is extreme nationalism with authoritarian and the military. Like the fascism was started by Mussolini. Hitler's a fascist. That's what you think about when you think about fascists. And then populism, which we've heard kind of some more talk about this, especially if you're into American politics with some of our Democratic presidential candidates who are called populists, but it supports all about the common people, so over the elites. So, for example, the people who, the Occupy movement, if you're familiar with that in the United States, which was the whole idea that the 1% of the population that controls most of the wealth is making most of the decisions. And populists, on the other hand, would argue that it needs to be in the rights of the common people. Okay, so these are important political ideology terms. Think about what examples that you would see of these in the different countries that we study. So, political participation. This is our next part. And so as we're talking about, we've already trained up our citizens. They know what our country believes. People are learning what they believe. And that's actually kind of our first question. How do citizens learn about politics in their country? And that's something that we've already talked about, how that it can come from your family. Media, of course, is a fantastic source. Education. Also, even for your religion can have that, your gender, your ethnicity, all of those things can play a role in part of as you develop your political ideology. And media, as we said, is a big part of that. And when we're thinking about our CG6, how is the media controlled in the different countries that we studied? And the countries that have the most control over their media are going to be our authoritarian regimes, China, Russia, and Iran. How much of what is we're receiving in education is propaganda? You know, what is being happened? I remember I went to a communist museum in the Czech Republic, and they had a little that had been actually like a time clock that you clocked in, and it said beside the time clock that being on time to work deals a death blow to capitalism. You know, it was even there that you saw. And then they had a simulated classroom, and there was a poem about the glory of farming that was on the board. And so you think about as you go into classrooms. For example, when I lived in Turkey, every single classroom in the school had to have a picture of Ataturk. They had to have a children's education thing that he had said. And so that's something, the government can use that to promote. Like if we were to go visit China, how many pictures, portraits are we going to see of Mao still left over from communism? Are we going to see of Xi Jinping? There's a lot of comparison that Xi Jinping is using a lot of that cult of personality that Mao had used. And hopefully I'm not using terms that you're unfamiliar with. If I'm using a term like cult of personality, you're like, what the heck is she talking about? Feel free to, to look those terms up. All right, so one of the things that's really important that you need to understand, so I have mentioned this several times, your test, comparative politics, our whole thing that we do in comparative politics is we compare one country to another. I mean, that's the big thing that we do. And so when we're thinking about that, we're comparing regimes. How is an authoritarian regime different than a democratic regime? What does political participation look like? Because they do have political participation in an authoritarian regime, but it definitely looks different. The vast majority of citizens in any country, they participate by voting, okay? So voting is how people often participate in any regime. Now, one of those interesting facts that we've seen, so remember we talked about this concepts of causation and correlation. There is definitely a relationship, a correlation between civil society and political participation. So in a more democratic regime, we're going to see a more active civil society and we're going to see more political participation. Okay, there is a correlation, definitely. And we can also argue that it's beyond a correlation, it is also a causation. that civil liberty, civil society, active civil societies, countries with active civil societies also have more political participation. Okay, I would argue that not only is there a correlation, but that is also a causation. So let's look at authoritarian versus democratic. So in an authoritarian, it may be more difficult to participate. And if you disagree with the party or group that is in control, you may get punished for your types of participation. So for example, in Russia, under the Constitution, you do actually have the right to protest, okay, to the right to assembly, what we would say in the United States. And however, in 2012, I believe it was, the Russian government passed a law that basically says that they have to approve of any protests, and you can be punished by law, breaking a law, if your protest is not approved by the government. So basically, if you're saying things kind of against the government, if it doesn't meet the government mandate. So there's a lot of controlling by the government how you participate. Now, you could choose to go out and protest, and for example, there any kind of protests or in favor of LGBT rights are very, very much not happening in Russia. So I could go out with a pride flag and a sign that I support LGBT rights if I'm a Russian citizen. Am I going to get arrested? Possibly, okay? And so you just have to be willing to accept those consequences if I disagreed with what the government says. So in a authoritarian, their basic political participation is really about obedience. Do I follow the laws? Do I do what the military tells me? Do I pay my taxes? And voting. Now, in one of my, I love John Green, DFTBA, guys. I love John Green. And my favorite crash course video is the one he does on China, which if you are having any weakness right now in China, Google that and watch it. It's going to cover Mao. It's going to cover Deng Xiaoping. It's going to cover all this important stuff that you need to know. And one of my favorite parts of that video is he says that China has a democratic dictatorship. It's all the fun of voting without the pesky thinking. And I just love that because you don't get a choice, okay? You don't get to elect the general secretary. You don't get to elect your president. Now, they do actually have, if you think about China, their most political participation actually happens at the local level. They are even allowed to have parties other than the Communist Party at the local level. However, if you want to get anywhere in China, you need to be in the Communist Party. Now, in a democratic government, we're going to see all kinds of participation. So citizens are going to be more active. The most common still is voting because not everybody is an engaged citizen. You can choose to join an interest group. You could be part of a social movement. And I mean, right now, it feels like a lot of our social movements happen almost through Facebook and Twitter and I guess maybe even Snapchat. I don't think so much on TikTok. Joining a political party. Okay, these are all different ways that you can be and actively participate in a democratic government. Okay, protests. You know, protest is considered participation. So it doesn't always have to be, I mean, hopefully it's a peaceful protest, but it doesn't have to be. But when you feel like something you need to speak up, that needs to happen. 2009, again, I'm going to mention the protests that they did against President Ahmadinejad. Now, most of us probably can't even pronounce Ahmadinejad. Living in the Middle East for 4 years definitely helps my pronunciation. But I apologize now for any Spanish word I can say. I'm very odd in this sense. But on your test, you're like, crap, I can't remember that guy's name. Don't worry about it. Just say the protests of the presidential election in 2009. It's okay if you don't write his specific name. So if you can describe the event that happened. And so again, they were protesting his re-election because they felt like it was unfair. Okay, so continuing on with this kind of concept, we also have to talk about the importance of civil liberties and civil rights. So I've been mentioning a lot of civil liberties and civil rights, and those words are often used interchangeably. I think the people who are the most picky about you using the correct definition are AP US government teachers. And so when we say civil liberties, we're talking about those basic rights that we believe humans have. The freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, okay, those kind of things. We often call them natural rights or unalienable rights. when we think about civil rights, this is where we're talking about discrimination. Okay, am I being discriminated against because of my race, because of my gender, because of my sexual orientation, because of my religious beliefs, because of my ethnic group? Those are all things that could play a part. So I've put a couple of examples here. When we think about, I think it's interesting, especially in authoritarian regimes, you're going to see, so I did a bit of reading of the Russian Constitution. I know, government nerd here. And in my study of the Russian Constitution, I was looking at things about freedom of religion and judicial review because I'm very interested in this concept of rule of law and how that works. And so what you'll find if you read the Russian Constitution, and I found the same thing, reading several other constitutions for a grad class that I was in, is that it says in the Russian Constitution that you have freedom of religion, that you have freedom of assembly. Those things exist. Do they happen in reality? Judicial review is in the Russian Constitution. Okay, that concept is there. Maybe not in the exact words, but the concept is there, just like the exact words aren't in the U.S. Constitution, but the implied concept. In reality, does it happen? In reality, is anybody questioning the leader? So when we look at China, does say that you have the right to assemble. However, they monitor and limit any kind of group's activities. There has been huge restrictions on human rights. So if you're looking at the freedom of the world, so this is all by Freedom House, and I borrowed this nice little chart that Mr. Kanine had done because he already had it all nice and organized. And I'll tell you right now, if you need some specific examples, one of your best source, Google Citizen U. I think the website is Citizen, like a U, the letter U, not Y-O-U, but citizenu.org. And then if you scroll down on the side, there's something that says the comparative corner, okay? And then he has provided this document that basically he took a lot of stuff from all these things that I'm sharing with you here, and then he also added in specific examples from countries for the 3 units that we're going to have on this test. And so that's really going to be your key, especially in the argumentative essays. You're going to have to provide a specific example for whatever concept that we're talking about. So if they're bringing up freedom of assembly, and what does that look like in an authoritarian regime? What does that look like in a democratic regime? Then you can talk about what it looks like in China, a specific. So when we think about restricting of human rights, all these things affect how free you are considered. Now, Freedom House has a ranking system. So of our CG6 and also the US, when we look at this, UK is the most free. In the US, Russia is considered not free, okay? Nigeria is partially free, Mexico is partially free, Iran and China are not free. Now, this should not come as any surprise to any of us. Our authoritarian regimes are not free, our democratic regimes are free. So, China, restricting human rights. For example, let's take the Uyghurs. They're the U-I-G-H-U-R-S. So not ever how I thought I was supposed to say it, but that is actually the correct pronunciation is Uyghurs. So the Uyghurs actually, they're having re-education camps in China. Not only do they not have rights, they are putting them into relocation camps, and they are re-educating them, trying to train them to have the right political ideology about the government. They have, now, on the other hand, what rights have they provided for minority groups? So 92% of China is Han Chinese, but there are over 50 different other ethnic groups that live in China. In Tibet, we also have the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs, Tibetans are probably the 2 most famous. So the Uyghurs are Muslim, Turkic, Mongolic people. And so they have a lot of restrictions on their movement and such. But if you think about the one-child policy, that was never enforced for any of the minority groups. And so that is one thing that they did provide for them. Iran pretty much functions the same way as China. They have a little bit more freedom than China, okay? And then I've mentioned already that Russia doesn't allow protests that are not approved by the government. So in summary, authoritarian regimes are going to monitor and limit your access to the media. They prefer secrecy to transparency, okay? The more transparent your country is, that's your step towards freedom. That's also going to help reduce corruption. So if we looked at, say, a transparency index, there's also, those are available, we're going to see that, so the UK is more transparent than, say, Nigeria, which suffers more with corruption. Okay, so those are all part of that. Then also remember that the way we define, are you a liberal or illiberal democracy, is we look at, are you protecting people's civil liberties and civil rights? So our last topic is cleavages. And so cleavages, simply put, are divisions. These are divisions that we see in society, and they can come in a variety of ways. Social cleavages are kind of our most common, but these are national, ethnic, linguistic, religious divisions that are in any society. So we have social class, ethnic, religious, regional. I'm going to give you major cleavages in every country that we study. Like, what are kind of some of the most common cleavages that we see? So if I'm thinking about, let's start with Mexico. I'm going to go in the order of the way that I teach the country. So in Mexico, urban versus rural is one of the most common cleavages that they have. There's a lot of difference between the urban versus rural community. They also have a division that's based on ethnic lines, which would be the Amerindians, who are the native, versus the mestizos, which are the Spanish and native mixed descendants, okay, which they are the majority of the population. Now, cleavages can result in conflicts, and there has been conflicts in all of these different countries that we study as a result of, and I'll try to mention them as I think about them. So, for example, the Zapatista movement, which happened right after NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, was passed, they took over part of, I believe it was the Chiapas state, and had quite a bit of protests. They want their language recognized. They wanted more rights. And they were the Zapatista movement, named after Emiliano Zapatista, were an Amerindian group. Okay, so that's an example of that. All right, let's talk about the UK. Probably the most famous division that's a religious one would be, when we think about in Northern Ireland, the Protestants versus the Catholics, which is actually what resulted in the division of Ireland, that the Republic of Ireland is the counties that were predominantly Catholic, and the Northern Ireland is the counties that were predominantly Protestant. And so things are much better in Ireland than they have been historically. And I would say they've basically been improving since Thatcher, when we start to look at some of the accords and different things that they signed in the past. Historically, social class has been the biggest cleavage in the UK. But there is a growing cleavage of, we could say, ethnic cleavage. So there are a lot of immigrants and the children of immigrants who are citizens of the UK, but there has been some definite results in ethnic and religious cleavages. So then we can go to Russia. So in Russia, one of my favorite cleavages is the Slavophile versus the Westernizer. So it's that Slavophile is the love of Slavic culture, and let's do the traditional, the way that we've always done it. The Westernizer kind of wanting to go back to the way, think about Peter the Great. He's your Westernizer, making everybody shave their beards and change their clothes. And then Slavophile, like Putin is a great Slavophile, like the importance of the Orthodox Church, all of those things. In Russia, there are lots of different ethnic groups in Russia. And so that's something to keep in mind. A conflict that we would see in Russia would be with the Chechens. The Chechens are a Muslim group. They live in a state. They have a lot of oil there. So that is not a state that the Russians are likely to ever give up. There have been several conflicts there, terrorist activities that have been attributed to the Chechens that they have also taken claim for. There's been a war there. It's a rough situation. And so they want to be their own independent state. Russia's not letting them go. So I don't see that happening anytime soon. Okay, so from Russia, then we go to China. So obviously we have the ethnic divisions. Urban versus rural is a huge one there too. I would also say gender. So as we start to see the fact that we're ending up with these gender disparities because of the one-child policy, which is no longer in effect, but the fact that we're now seeing the results of that, and that there was a preference for boys. And so in many towns, we're talking about not just 10 to 1. I think the most startling ones I've seen are 100 to 1. And I think there's one place where it's like even like 1,000 boys to every one girl. So Chinese ladies definitely getting their choice of who they might want to marry. And so from China, then I teach Iran. And so there are definite religious cleavages there. So while the majority of Iranians are Shia Muslim, there is respect and rights for religious minority groups. They have some specific actually rights, and that would be for the Christians, the Jews, and the Zoroasters. However, there is another minority group who have a religious faith called Baha'i. And Baha'i is not accepted by mainline Muslims. And the Baha'i faith are greatly persecuted. They don't get the same rights as the other religious minority groups. Speaking too of like ethnic groups, the Kurds are a significant ethnic group that are looking for their own state, their own nation, and they've been more of an issue in Turkey and in Iraq, specifically because Saddam Hussein he killed 3 million of them in a genocide in Iraq, but the Kurds would be part of that as well. So then we have Nigeria, and when you think Nigeria, man, you need to think ethnic cleavages. I always tell my students when we're thinking about countries, like when I think about Mexico, I think about the PRI. When I think about the UK, I think about the Queen, tradition. When I think about Russia, I think about Putin. When I think about China, I think about the Communist Party. When I think about Iran, I think about religion. And when I think about Nigeria, it says ethnic cleavages. There are 3 major ethnic groups: the Yoruba, the Hausa, and the Igbo, or Hausa Fulani and the Igbo. But there are lots of others. I mean, we're talking about over 200 and some different linguistic and ethnic groups, and the fact that they're all trying to get along. One group actually in the South tried to break off, and it was a civil war, and tried to create their own state called Biafra. And that didn't end up working out. It was a very bloody civil war, but they have remained together. Biafra is down near the Niger Delta, which is a very oil-rich area, and this would have really devastated Nigeria had they been able to break out. So I'm just going to mention the whole concept of coinciding and cross-cutting cleavages, and I have 2 examples here. I have Belgium at the top, and then I have Switzerland. So coinciding cleavages basically reinforce your differences. That, for example, in Belgium, there is a significant cleavage of the Flemish-speaking people versus the French-speaking people. And so when we look at, say, Belgium, the north is where we tend to find the Flemish speakers. They tend to come from maybe wealthier area. And so it's like one cleavage just reinforces the other. And the same thing happens kind of in the South, where you've got the Wallonia, the French who are in the South, the poorer area. And so we call this coinciding cleavages because they have all these cleavages that keep them in that same kind of, we're all grouped together. And all that does is actually weaken a society because it further divides them because they're less likely to come together. Okay. So maybe the North was wealthy, but they also had a lot of French speakers. That would have a way to kind of unite the North and South, which is what we see in, say, Switzerland, which has what we call cross-cutting cleavages that strengthens their society by bringing people together. So they have all these different groups of people speaking all these different languages. They have several official languages. And so in that sense, that because I live in the North, but I speak German, so it helps me relate to somebody who lives in the South who also speaks German. So there's what we call cross-cutting cleavages that complement each other, and that leads to less division in society. Okay, time to do some practice questions. So I did not write these. I'm not taking any credit for these. These all come from Mr. Kaneen. And there is that website up there in the corner, the Citizen U. You can go to the comparative corner. So let's try to knock these out pretty quickly here. So argumentative essay. We're going to have to do a thesis. We're going to have to pick a side. We're going to have to focus on our concept. And then we're going to have to give examples. Your examples can both come from one country. They do not have to come from 2 different countries, though often it would be better to come from 2 different countries. Just really kind of depends on your question and also maybe your knowledge. Develop an argument that explains whether political participation through voting or through civil society groups is the best indicator of a democratic regime. Ooh, I like this question. Now, what I'd like you to do is I'd love for you to pause me and you think what actually is the answer to this. And we're also going to be looking at the course concept is going to be democratization. And of course, we've got to give a defensible claim. So pause, think about it. So you either paused and now you're back, welcome back, or you are just now tuning in, or you're still with me. So here's what I would actually say. I would say that, and I love this question because I actually think it's a fabulous question. I would actually go with my thesis would be that political participation is a better indicator political participation through civil society is the best indicator that you have a democratic regime showing democratization, or even, I got a better word, democratic consolidation, right? So if we talk about, now we've got to look at my choices though, right? So I've got, here's what I would talk about Mexico, about how Mexico has been democratizing, becoming more democratic. That's a better word. I'm trying to make a new word. How that Mexico has been becoming more democratic, and they have been expanding their civil society. That the entire time that they've been a country, that they've been voting since they led the revolution in 1917, and they got rid of the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. They've been voting, but they had 80 years of the rule by one party, by the PRI, 70-year rule by the PRI. That wasn't very democratic, and a lot of people were showing up to vote. Just because people show up to vote doesn't make you democratic. Like, I wish China was on here, right? They're not. So I would use Mexico to show how that they're increasing their civil society, which makes them more democratic. You could also use that statement that that it is a known correlation that the more civil society you have, more active civil society you have, the more political participation that you have. I would use as my example to prove that I'm right. I would then use Russia and talk about how Russia doesn't have an active civil society. And while they have a pretty decent voter turnout, but they're not a democratic regime. And actually, democratization has taken a step back, okay, under Putin. And I would talk about that and give specific examples to talk about some of those things, okay? So that's one way to approach the question. So you're going to make sure you've picked a side. You're going to make sure you've included your concept. Explain any important definitions. So if I choose to include democratic consolidation in my title, I want to explain that. I want to tell people what a civil society is so they know I know what it is, okay? Define what the civil society is. And then you're going to give your specific examples and explain anything through that you can. All right, I think that the quantitative in many ways has the potential to be the easier of the questions because you at least have a chart and data over there. But it does, of course, take your knowledge as well, and you only have 15 minutes. And I think that is not a lot of time. So the same thing on the other. You only have 25 minutes. That's why it's important. It is open note, guys, but you got to know what those terms mean, that you're able to define them. All right, so let's look at our chart here. Citizen participation across the countries. Hey, this is what we're just talking about, right? How that people can vote, but that doesn't mean that they, doesn't mean that it's a democratic regime. One of my, tons of people turned out and voted for Saddam Hussein. That doesn't mean it was authoritarian at all. Okay, so voter turnout we have, participated in interest group, and signed a petition. All right, we've got UK, we've got our CG6 here. Okay, sorry for the interruption. My battery died. Okay, so explain how a pattern of data in the table demonstrates democratization in the UK. So, democratization, what have we talked about? Let's tie this back to civil society. They have one of the highest civil societies on the chart because, well, participation in interest group, which of course is part of civil society, signing a petition, okay? So we do have political participation. So the fact that we have active political participation, I would focus more on that. Voting doesn't necessarily, high voter turnout doesn't always mean democratization, okay? Define what democratization is, the growth of democracy. Talk about that being in an interest group is a type of civil society and participation in civil society, and that signing a petition is type of political participation. Draw a conclusion about political culture in China. So as we look at China, we could say that Voting is not part of their political culture, okay? That political participation, other than maybe obeying laws, is not a big part of their political culture. So that's what I'm seeing here, is that I'm not seeing an active, engaged society, that they're not maybe even allowed to sign a petition. Explain how the data in the table demonstrates the civil society in 2 of the listed countries. I would talk about UK and Mexico, and I would talk about how that they had the highest on the chart, and how that they used to be corporatist states and now they're pluralist states, which means that they used to be countries that did not have active civil society. I would define civil society. I would make sure that I say that civil society has to be voluntary and that it is not controlled by the government, that participation is voluntary and not controlled by the government. And I would say that how those are happening in both the UK and Mexico. That would be the 2 countries that I would choose. All right, guys, so that wraps up everything for Unit 3. I will be doing a live review Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, the day before the exam. That would be on the 21st of May, that you can watch live and join us, chat any questions, or of course you'll be able to watch it afterwards. I hope these have been helpful for you, and I do have some other reviews that are country specific that you are welcome to check out as well.